Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's training. We're just going to take a minute or so and allow everyone to join and get acclimated, and then we will get this program started. So welcome. So we're going to go ahead and get started. This is wonderful. I see we have about 100 people here so far, and we are expecting more to join, so that's great. So my name is Sabria Hassan, and I am the Director of Programs at the Banneker-Douglass Museum, the state's official museum on African American history and culture, located in downtown Annapolis, Maryland. The museum is a unit of the Governor's Office on Community Initiatives, and this evening's program is brought to you by the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and our community partners, the Anne Arundel Arts Council, Four Rivers Heritage Area, the Community Foundation of Anne Arundel County, the Sonia E. Swaggart Family Fund, and all of the supporters of the Banneker-Douglass Museum's Foundation 2021 Anti-Racism Initiatives. In February of this year, the Banneker-Douglass Museum formed an anti-racism coalition. This coalition, made up of experts, art educators, and community leaders, is responsible for advising the museum as we develop relevant programs, exhibitions, and other visitor experiences. The coalition will ensure that we are leveraging our programs, exhibitions, and collections to amplify and encourage community building and racial equity. Coalition members have been working closely with museum staff to plan and then evaluate 2021 anti-racism programs. Tonight's program is our inaugural training, and we would like to recognize and thank the coalition members for their contribution to this piece of work. And you'll see their pictures on the screen. Dr. Amina Johnson, Will Jernigan, Nicole Johnson, Joanna Doty, Dr. David Fakunle, Maya Davis, and Gina Lewis. Right now, I would like to introduce the chair on the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, Dr. Reverend Tamara E. Wilson, who will further address the audience on the significance of tonight's training.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, I welcome you to tonight's training. As an African American, my head and heart are filled with emotions, having just heard less than an hour ago that Derek Chauvin has been found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. While we celebrate this victory of justice, it also serves as a reminder that the work of dismantling systemic racism continues. That's why tonight's program, or programming like tonight's training, is so critically important. I hope that you, like me, have come to learn and to be empowered to do your part in this most important work. I trust that you will learn a lot. I now will turn it over to our Executive Director, Chanel Compton.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. Hello, everyone. My name is Chanel Compton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Banneker-Douglass Museum and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. I want to first thank you all for joining us this evening. This is an important discussion, and I appreciate you all giving your time, your energy to be a part of it. I'd like to thank, of course, Reverend Dr. Tamara E. Wilson, Chair of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, and all of the commissioners for the important work that you do of protecting and preserving Maryland's rich and diverse Black history. A special thank you to the Arts Council of Arundel County, Four Rivers Heritage Area, the Community Foundation of Arundel County, the Sonia E. Swigert Family Fund, and all of the supporters of the Banneker-Douglass Museum Foundation and our 2021 Anti-Racism Initiative. Thank you to the Governor's Coordinating Office, especially the Governor's Office of Community Initiative. We have the Chief of Staff here tonight, Mr. Winston Wilkinson. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And last but not least, thank you to the Banneker-Douglass Museum staff. We have a small but mighty staff here who make all of this work possible. Now, before we continue with the program, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the verdict that was just handed down in the Derek Chauvin case. I think we can all agree on taking a collective sigh of relief in the fact that he was found guilty. While this is a very important step in the right direction in improving social justice and holding police accountable for the crimes committed against Black people in America, there is still much work to be done. And that is why we are here tonight. The Banneker-Douglass Museum and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture are dedicated to documenting, protecting, preserving, and promoting African American history and culture in Maryland. And we continue to make strides to bring forth social justice and be a resource for social change. With that said, we have a tremendous program in store for you tonight with amazing facilitators, Dr. David Reed and Dresden Lackey, who will both provide you with valuable information on the historical foundations of racism in America. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the program. Ms. Hassan.
Thank you so much, Chair Wilson and Director Compton. Now I would like to introduce our first facilitator. And please note that at the end of this training, we are asking everyone, if they can, to just please complete a short survey. And also note that we have compiled a one-page resource document that will be sent out to all registrants immediately following this training. Now for Dr. Reed. Dr. David Leon Reed holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in history from Bowie State University and a doctorate in United States history with a minor in education and African American history from Morgan State University. After studying at Cornell's Africana Study Center, Dr. Reed began teaching history at the secondary and collegiate level and has been doing so for the past 20 years. He has been a guest lecturer for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, the African American History Society at the National Archives, and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In addition, Dr. Reed has taught a wide range of history courses in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, including world civilization, United States history, methods of teaching social studies, and African American history. During the summers, Dr. Reed has served as a public member for the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development Promotional Boards. Currently, Dr. Reed is an assistant professor of history and coordinator for secondary education in the Department of History and Government at Bowie State University and an adjunct lecturer at Howard University. Dr. David Reed.
Thank you, Director Hassan, and my colleagues at the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. This is a very important subject, and I'd like to share a PowerPoint and walk everyone through kind of a brief legal history of institutionalized racism in the United States. This history actually begins during the colonial era, which for those of us engaged in the study of US history starts in the early 1600s, and it goes for about 170 years, the colonial era does, up through 1776 at the time of the American Revolution. And then from the American Revolution, we'll deal with that time period from the American Revolution of 1776 up to the American Civil War, which was some 80 to 90 years later. And then from the Civil War, I like to take it up through Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction to the era that deals with Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the legalization of racial segregation in the United States. So when we look at the legal history of the United States and how it has unfolded over time, we'll see very clearly that racism was an invention of the founding fathers of the nation, and it's something that was an issue at the Constitutional Convention even. You know, it's something that was debated, it was something that was argued, it was something that was a part of the evolutionary development of democracy and freedom and notions of equality, justice, what's right, what's wrong, etc. So most of us don't walk around thinking about the colonial era very much, but I like to highlight how documents teach us a lot about what it has meant to be an American and who is an American and what their status is in what becomes the United States. So we're going to look at some documents and look at some at the state level and the federal level and see if we can make sense of how racism became institutionalized in what we're now calling the United States of America. So it begins with the 13 colonies. And we have to remember that all 13 colonies engaged in the institution of slavery. A lot of times when we think of slavery, we think it's a Southern institution, and it was, but it was also an institution that permeated literally all 13 colonies from as far south as Georgia to as far north as Massachusetts. All states engaged in slavery. They all didn't engage in plantation slavery, but there was urban slavery. Sometimes there was slavery with skilled slaves, there were barbers and there were beauticians and there were ship caulkers and there were other artisans that still did not own themselves. And so they were slaves in places like New York and New Jersey, et cetera, et cetera. But we're gonna start off in Virginia. In Virginia, we have the first entry written in English by a gentleman named John Rolfe, who was the proprietor of the colony. And he jotted down 20 and odd Negroes arrived today. It was in August. And this is at Jamestown, Virginia. And apparently he traded food for the 20 and odd Negroes that arrived at Jamestown. And so the initial group of 20 Africans were actually classified as indentured servants, meaning they worked for a period of time set by the colonial legislature, normally 5 to 7 years. And then after you serve out your indenture, then you get freedom and you get some land and you hope to engage in farming. And tobacco, of course, is the big crop in the early settlement of Virginia and Maryland. So this early group, we know from looking at the legal history, were indentured servants like other actual poor white people who were indentured servants, mainly Irish and even poor Englishmen that had been taken over to the New World to pay off debt. In some cases, it was to get rid of the undesirables, the pickpocket thieves and the vagabonds and even prostitutes and other persons that were in prisons and in jails in England. And so going to the New World was an opportunity for them to work off their debt and perhaps get land and get freedom. So the early history of the colonial Virginia shows that there were different types of people. There were, of course, those who owned land like John Rolfe and others. And then there were unfree people like indentured servants who are poor white people that don't own land. They are confined to the plantation. They need permission to leave the plantation. They're working off their debt. And then there are this initial group of Africans that are, again, working as indentured servants. But then when we study that history closely, we begin to see that as early as 1662, there is laws created in Virginia, statutory laws that recognize slavery as a permanent condition of servitude. And the law specifically states that children born in the colonies take the status of their mother. So that meant that relations between white men and African women produced offspring that were slaves. So if a child is born a slave, they're a slave for life. And this is in 1662 at the Virginia House of Burgess, which is the colonial lawmaking body. We see other laws, and I'm not going to repeat all the laws on every slide, but I'm going to highlight a few of the laws. Like 1667, baptism does not bring freedom. Initially, it was seen improper for a Christian to enslave another Christian. So the Africans arriving, many of them were not Christians. Some of them were Muslims, some of them practiced various African religions. But if they converted to Christianity, that was one way for them to try to avoid being enslaved. So in 1667, the legislature saw fit to change the law. And these are laws that are still, one can study these laws by looking at the early colonial history of Virginia. When you look at the colonial laws, you can see a long range of laws starting in the 1660s that begin to distinguish people based on white, mulatto, Negro. The language begins to change and the status begins to change. There was even an act prohibiting interracial marriage. You see the early miscegenation laws in Virginia starting in 1691. All of this is background. We're still not at the United States. This is the colonial era. We don't get to the United States until 1776. So this early history in Virginia, where there are distinctions based on race and distinctions based on religion, and people are being classified and people are being categorized, who can own land, what type of work a person does, who can get married, what is the status of offspring between African men and African women versus African men and white women versus white men and African women. So there are all these issues that are being resolved at the colonial legislative level. And so Virginia, increasingly, as the labor shortage becomes acute, and they're looking for labor. They need to cut down the forest, and they need workers to grow tobacco, and they need this labor. And white Englishmen that are poor, the numbers aren't big enough. They're not getting enough people in the colony to satisfy this labor shortage. So, they're looking to give someone either an indenture or to enslave people in order to satisfy the labor shortage. And we can see by the census reports in 1700 that slaves composed actually half of Virginia's unfree population. And so the numbers of African peoples coming into the colony is beginning to increase to the point that in 1705, we see the first Virginia slave codes. This involves property rights and land rights and voting rights, and it prohibits African people or Black people from owning firearms. They begin to establish a separate court system to try slaves that have been accused of crimes. And but they also reaffirmed the legalization of buying and selling slaves is codified into law as legal. One has to consider, what is the purpose of law, any law, whether you're talking about ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, or ancient Mesopotamia, or any society or given civilization. The law teaches us what that society thinks is right, what that society thinks is wrong. It teaches us what that society creates as its ideals, meaning the laws are what make a society civil in a sense, because it's what distinguishes human beings from the lower animals, that we have things that you can do and things that you cannot do, and there are crimes and penalties associated with breaking the law. So when you study any given society, look at their laws And that'll tell you a lot about what that society thinks is right and wrong. And it's clear in early colonial Virginia that owning a human being, buying and selling Africans is completely legal. It is completely within the bounds of what is allowed in colonial society. So I think, when we go further and, we begin to see that even slaves that are fighting back, there are even penalties against that. There was a case where 6 servants and a Negro started to run away, and when they were captured, the white indentured servant received a lesser sentence. The Negro was given 30 lashes on his back, and they burned an R on his cheek to indicate that, of course, he was property, and he had to serve an extra year on his indenture. So even within the indentured servants, there were distinctions that are being made. And again, these things are being codified into law, which is institutional racism. Here's another one from the 1705 slave code. I'm not going to read all of these, but some of these I do want to highlight. This one is important. Be it enacted and declared by this grand assembly, if any slave resist his master, and others by his master's order correcting him, and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be considered a felony, but the master or that person appointed by the master to punish him be acquit from molestation, since it cannot be presumed that the malice existed, which alone makes murder a felony, or that anything should induce a man to destroy his own estate. So even if a slave resists the master and is killed in the process, there's really no penalty for that. And again, this is written in the code. It's written in the Virginia Slave Code. So, these indentured servants are working on these plantations, many of them poor Irishmen, to the point that 2/3 of the white people that are in colonial Virginia, by the time you get to the 1700s, 2/3 of them came as indentured servants. It's not the upper classes that are coming from England over to the New World. They're the poor classes, the classes that didn't own land. And, the records show us that many of these people were, again, pickpocket thieves and vagabonds, murderers, and others. They're described as undesirables in English society coming over to the New World to pay for their passage. And this is not just Virginia. I'm highlighting Virginia, but this is really true in all 13 of the colonies, these indentured servants. What's also interesting and clear is from the study of the laws, we see that many of the same things that are going to happen to Black people during slavery, it was almost as if they had a practice or a pre-trial practice with indentured servants. Indentured servants that were white could not marry without permission. They were subject to physical punishment, including being tied up and whipped. They had to negotiate their labor contracts, which were enforced by the local courts. If women got pregnant, they got extended sentences. So there are all these restrictions of the poor white indenture that are later going to be transferred to the enslaved population. And of course, these poor whites did not own land, so they couldn't vote and had no way around that. So it's interesting to look also at how, as a tobacco colony, the motive, of course, is profit. So when one looks at the institution of whether it's indentured servants or you look at slavery, it's easy to get emotional about it and look at it. But I think during the 17th century, they were looking at the most efficient way to have a labor force that's going to yield a profit in tobacco. And we can see by the records that in 1624, there were 200,000 pounds were being grown. By the 1616, 15 million pounds. And 25 years later, 30 million pounds of tobacco are being grown in Virginia, and Maryland was almost was comparable to that as well. So a lot of this is profit motive as the tobacco plantations begin to increase in colonial Virginia. Native Americans were enslaved at one point, but the Native Americans, number one, knew the land very well. They had knowledge of the land and they could fight back and escape. And we have actually some almost comical records of, not that slavery would be comical, but we captured 15 Indians on Monday. Wednesday, we only have 2. Where did they go? They escaped into the woods. They escaped into the forest. So there was a frustration in these diaries and in these records of the planter class that are established in these plantations, that they could not keep Native Americans enslaved, mainly because of war. They died from diseases and mainly knowledge of the land as well. So they're going to, and then poor whites, of course, are going to, at the end of their indenture, 5 to 7 years, then they're free. They're free to try to obtain land and is registered with the local court. So that couldn't be really a permanent condition of servitude. So eventually they're going to turn from poor whites as indentured servants, and they were indentured all the way up through the American Revolution. So we're still talking about 150, 160 year period where there were unfree white people living in the country until the American Revolution. And then there were unfree Black people again in that early period from 1619 up to the 1660s until the laws changed. And then the Native Americans aren't going to work for the reasons that I explained. So eventually they're going to settle on Africans being the permanent solution to the labor problem of tobacco workers. And Black skin is associated then with being a slave. Africans did not know the land and could not escape like the Native American. Africans can't blend into the population like a poor Irishman can escape off the plantation. And we have records and advertisements for runaway Irishmen that make it from Maryland to Pennsylvania or Maryland to Delaware escaping, but they can blend in because they have white skin. But the African has brown skin or Black skin, can't run away. And so not knowing the land and not being able to run away, and of course coming across after the Middle Passage, many weren't in condition to run away anyway. But even after you start your new life as a slave, it's very difficult for the African person. So when we talk about identity and the institutionalization of racism, we see that skin color becomes a badge of servitude in colonial Virginia and the other 13 colonies. And soon it is assumed that one is a slave rather than a free person. And so we see that in the early colonial history of Virginia. I also wanted to take a look at some of the big documents, because institutional racism starts at the colonial level. It starts at the state level. It starts with Virginia. It starts with Maryland. It starts with individual states, and each individual state has its own version of laws to regulate the slave population. And so, but there are also big documents. And one of the big documents was the Declaration of Independence. I have no intention of reading this long quote, but Thomas Jefferson, of course, the brilliant writer, the 33-year-old attorney from Virginia, also a slaveholder, is going to be tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence, literally the document that declared the 13 colonies free from England. In the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he had a clause where he blamed King George III of England, and you can get a copy of this. This is not something that is hard to find. Look for the original Declaration of Independence, where he talks about the cruel war waged against human nature by an unoffending people. He's talking about African people, how men are bought and sold in service of the king. Because of course, the king financed and sponsored the transatlantic slave trade, but Jefferson talks about how you're depriving these people of life and liberty, and the crimes against them are something that should stop. Now, this is coming from Thomas Jefferson, who was also a slaveholder himself. But by the time this was read by the other members of the colonial governments, particularly South Carolina and North Carolina, they said, no, Tom, take that part out. So the slave clause is removed in the final draft of the Declaration of Independence that was ratified on July 4th, 1776, makes no mention of slavery because of the reaction of Jefferson's colleagues. But it's interesting that they're wrestling with whether or not slavery is right or wrong. And in this instance, in one of our most sacred political documents, Jefferson actually says, yes, it's wrong, and it's because the king has sanctioned this, the King of Great Britain. So the big documents, again, teach us about the ideals of the nation and this great paradox of a document that frees the 13 colonies from, and announces to the world the freedom of the 13 colonies from their ties to Great Britain, but at the same time, the 13 colonies were still engaging in the transatlantic slave trade and slavery itself. And so you see this paradox in the document. By 1787, it was time to recreate a new constitution to hold the colonies together. And one of the first things that the new government did as they moved from the colonial era now to the United States of America, we see that the Constitution is first established as the supreme law of the land. That this Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It's the highest law that we have. And they did that because they wanted it to be made known that the 13 colonies each have their own state governments, but they all must submit to the unification of the country under the US Constitution. So 55 men between May of 1787 and September of 1787, 55 of them met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they met in secrecy. And we have, as historians, we look at primary documents, we have what's nicknamed Madison's diary. And Madison wrote down the big arguments and the big negotiations that took place at the Constitutional Convention that took place again for a 4-month period. And one of the big questions was, how are we going to resolve the question of representation in Congress? How many people, how many representatives go from Maryland? How many should go from New York, a more populated state? How many should go from Massachusetts or Georgia? How do we determine that number? And in Article 1, Section 2, after saying the whole number of free persons, which indicates that there were some unfree people called indentured servants, and it says, including those bound by a term of indenture. And then it talks about Native Americans that are taxed, which means that there were Native Americans that were included in the mathematics of each state's population. And then that devastating phrase, 3/5 of all other persons. Who are those other persons? The other persons are Black people. The other persons are Africans. So the 3/5 compromise, which as a fraction, 3/5, but as a percentage is 60% of the slave population, can be included with the free white population, the indentured or unfree white population, and the Native American population for purposes of, that are taxed for purposes of representation. And that complicated mathematics you can read in Article 1, Section 2. Now, historians have debated whether they were trying to reduce the humanity of these African peoples. But the point is that they were not looked at as full men and full women. Now, the northern states, according to Madison, said, wait a second, you have a larger African population than we do. You can't count your Africans, they're property. How can you count property? You're going to count horses and chickens and cows as well? And of course, South Carolina led the way by saying, no, but we should be able to include some of our slave population, if not all. And so that's where they get the 3/5 compromise, according to James Madison in his diary. So anytime the supreme law of the land declares you as 3/5 of a person, you're in trouble. And so this is the beginning of national institutional racism, in my humble opinion, when the supreme law of the land declares that Black people are 3/5 of a human being. Even though it was for purposes of representation in Congress, this is still the highest document that the country has at this time and even now. So that was a serious, serious clause in the Constitution, and you can read that at your own leisure. In Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, we see another instance where Black people are mentioned. In this case, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. So from 1787 to 1808, which was a 20-year period, there was an extension on the transatlantic slave trade. The colonists began to see that there was an increasing number of Black people that were coming in the country as slaves, and it was almost getting dangerous. South Carolina, almost half of South Carolina's population was Black people, and Virginia was close behind that. And you could see the census records begin to indicate that, wow, this large number of Africans that are being brought into the country is dangerous because they feared insurrection. And of course, we have that great Stono Rebellion of 1739 as a prime example of that. Later in the 1800s, of course, we have the Nat Turner Revolt. And so the other slave revolts in 1811, there was a slave revolt in Louisiana. A colleague taught me about that recently. So, after the Haitian Revolution, so there's an influence there. So these colonists, these founding fathers are leery of bringing too many Africans into the country because of resurrection. But there's something else here. Not only are they saying, okay, there's a 20-year extension on bringing African peoples into the country, but the last part of the clause says that a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. What does that mean? It means that a slave ship that is bringing in 300 African people or 400 or 500 African people, that there is a $10 tax, up to $10 for each person. So how much money is being made by the federal government taxing these slave ships that are coming to port in Annapolis, where the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture is situated? How many ships left England, went to Africa, got Africans, and then came over to the New World with 300, 400, 500 Africans, and the ships are being taxed $10 for each person, which means that the federal government now, not only have they recognized Black people as 3/5 of a man, but now they're making money through the early tax system on Africans being brought into the country. So from 1787 to 1865, when the 13th Amendment was abolished slavery in December of 1865, you're talking about a 78-year period where slave ships were coming in to the country and they were being taxed. And even after 1808, which was supposed to be, the extension of the slave trade was supposed to end in 1808, there was slave smuggling. There was always ships coming into the country that are being smuggled. So, there were ships coming into the country smuggling Africans, and even if the federal government wasn't getting money from that, there's still the recognition of slavery at that point was already well entrenched. So, you can't really stop those pirate ships. We don't have a lot of evidence that pirate ships were stopped a lot during this time period from the 1808 to 1865. So, but the other significant thing, of course, is since we're talking about institutional racism, is that, again, the US Constitution is affirming that it is okay to transport African peoples on these slave ships to come into the United States. So Article 1 was about the 3/5 compromise, Article 1, Section 2, and then Article 1, Section 9 deals with the extension of the transatlantic slave trade. The other thing that Madison shows us in the Constitution is the Fugitive Slave Clause in Article 4, Section 2. No person held to service or labor in one state escaping into another shall be discharged, but shall be what? Delivered up to whom such service shall be due. This is what historians and legal scholars call the Fugitive Slave Clause, where, again, runaways that escape off the plantation can now be captured and brought back to the plantation, meaning just because you escape across the Mason-Dixon line, which was established in 1787 by two land surveyors, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, that artificial line between North and South, Pennsylvania is the beginning of the North, Maryland is the beginning of the South. Even though I talk to Marylanders every day who don't think they're Southern, you are, we are. But if you make it across the Mason-Dixon line into the North, not only did slavery exist in the North, but even though there were larger pockets of free people, you can be delivered up and captured and brought back. And there were professional bounty hunters that were paid to look for runaways. And of course, Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave, is probably the most dramatic or well-known example of a free Black person living in upstate New York who's captured and sold into slavery. But this law was more about slaves or runaways that escape, that the federal law says that you do not escape the duty that you had. You're not discharged from the duty that you have been assigned as a slave. So 3/5 compromise, the extension of the slave trade, and the fugitive slave law are all in the United States Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And to me, that is significant that what I call the big documents support this notion of institutionalized racism. And because it's taken place over such a long period of time, even though some of these things are null and void by the time we get to the Civil War, the long history of institutionalized racism set the tone and set the precedent for racism to continue. We also have to remember that out of the first 18 presidents, from George Washington in 1789 all the way to Ulysses S. Grant, that 12 of these 18 presidents, not in a row, were actually slaveholding presidents. George Washington owned slaves on his plantation. Thomas Jefferson, the third president, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, and the list goes on all the way through Andrew Jackson, all the way up through Ulysses S. Grant. So you're talking about 12 out of 18 presidents were slaveholders, and that's not including the congressmen that were slaveholders. This is just dealing with the presidents. I'm going to show that list to you again. Most people know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. We know that. But James Madison, the father of the Constitution, was a slaveholder along with these others. Most of them were from Virginia. Some of them were like Martin Van Buren, were from New York. So looking at the presidents as the owners of slaves is something that is fascinating. And again, if I had more time, we would walk through the congressmen from the several, from the 13 colonies and the other states that were slave-owning congressmen. The number is pretty large. We get to the Civil War, and of course, many scholars are looking more at this, particularly since the fascinating work of Ava DuVernay in her documentary 13th, and the other sister who wrote the book, Michelle Alexander, right, who dealing with the new Jim Crow, because they recognized, as legal scholars did even before these books were written, that the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery for punishment of a crime, except as punishment for a crime for the duly convicted, meaning slavery was legally abolished in 1865, but that clause in the middle, except as punishment for a crime of the duly convicted, means that a convicted felon is now reduced to slave status in the federal Constitution. It was a loophole, a legal loophole, that we're going to abolish slavery. But in abolishing slavery, they created a clause within the abolition of slavery that led to a new era of arresting Black men and Black women to be incarcerated and classified as felon, which means that now you can't vote, which means now you can't own property, which means now you can't own a firearm. And even worse than that, it means that you are now being reduced to slave status and you lose part of your citizenship. So the 13th Amendment is a good thing in terms of the abolition of slavery, but it is not completely, it wasn't the complete answer to African Americans who had been enslaved. And there were some 4.5 million that were liberated as a result of the Civil War, but they weren't out of the woods yet because of this clause in the middle of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So David Oshinsky also wrote a fascinating book, Worse Than Slavery, where he talks about how the basic premise that when African peoples were owned by white masters, they were only so brutal. I mean, they were brutal, but it's an investment in property. But when you look at slavery being abolished, now the workers that are coming to these plantations to work, nobody owns them. So the philosophy is, if you talk back, if you don't work fast enough, or if you're caught stealing, you can be given a life sentence in prison in terms of the convict lease system, and you're more expendable because nobody owns you. There's no investment there. So Worse Than Slavery is a fascinating look at the convict lease system, particularly Parchman Prison. And there were some other ones like Angola in Louisiana, Parchman Prison in Mississippi, where a lot of our great blues singers coming out of that Mississippi Delta. I'm a B.B. King fan and the other great bluesmen from that era. So the Reconstruction era clearly shows the connection between hiring out these convicted felons from, in other words, if you're caught stealing a chicken, or if you steal some jewelry, or you break in, or you're belligerent in public, or you break or any laws, you're given a stiff sentence, and then you're hired out to a private company. So prison labor becomes the labor for coal mining companies and railroad companies, laying tracks and plantations, picking cotton. Cotton didn't go anywhere just because slavery was abolished. The economic system of growing the cotton changed in terms of, it's not slaves growing the cotton, it's convicted felons growing the cotton, or sharecroppers growing the cotton, even ditch digging. And we're talking about, for the coal mines, if you get accused of a crime and sent to certain jails in places like Kentucky and Western Pennsylvania and other places, even down in the deeper South, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and working all the way until 8 o'clock at night. So they worked you to death. And you can look at the Black codes in my last 2 or 3 minutes here. You can look at the state laws, the Black codes, which were state laws to govern the newly freed Black population. Despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the state level laws were still very, very restrictive. Read Khalil Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness. That's a good one. By the time we get to Plessy, of course, with the Plessy verdict, there's a separation in all walks of life. Again, institutional racism, meaning once they said that Plessy, once he lost his case, then it meant that buses, trains, bathrooms, movie theaters, restaurants can all legally separate or segregate the races. And again, it's state law, it's federal law. I mean, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, that's binding on all 50 states. So that is devastating. In my mother's home state of Georgia, even laws like unlawful for amateur white baseball team to play baseball on any vacant lot or baseball diamond within 2 blocks of a playground devoted to the Negro race. So even in sport, we can see racism. And it's not just in the South. Massachusetts prohibited marriage and fornication between Negroes and mulattoes. Even as laid back as we think they are out in California, all marriages of white people with Negroes, Mongolians, members of the Malay race, or mulattoes are illegal and void. These are, again, state level laws that during the Reconstruction period, which is the time period after the Civil War, leading up to Plessy versus Ferguson. 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, even the right to vote was curtailed with the literacy test and the poll tax. Poor sharecroppers in Mississippi can't afford to pay a poll tax. So these are, again, restrictive laws at the state level to stop Black people from voting. The grandfather clause included literacy test. Most of these Africans liberated from slavery were illiterate, couldn't read or write. So these are ways that state governments got around federal law. Again, institutional racism. This is not just a theory or some sort of esoteric theory. No, you can look at these laws. You can look at the laws from the colonial era, the era of the Civil War, and the era of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction going up to 1900, and you'll see that we have an almost 300-year history of institutionalized racism. And the Black codes and the Jim Crow laws, particularly after Plessy, lasted all the way until the Civil Rights Movement into the 1960s. They were still dealing with the aftermath of Plessy versus Ferguson. So one could do a state-by-state study to see that institutional racism was widespread. There were only a few states that didn't engage in institutional racism, but the vast majority did. So in this very brief snapshot of looking at racism from the colonial era through post-Reconstruction, I hope that you are inspired to do your own research even, and to read more, and to look at how these state laws and federal laws kind of set the tone for racism to be this persistent thing that Americans still have to deal with down to the present. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Reed. It was so, it was brief, but so informative. And I hate to put you on the spot with this, but we do have some attendees who are asking if that PowerPoint would be available, beyond this training. I don't know if you are able to or willing to share it, but if so, You can go ahead and unmute. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh yes, most definitely. I'm honored and flattered. Certainly, the PowerPoint, I can forward it to you, and I also was going to add a list of other sources from all kinds of scholars across the spectrum, history and sociologists and others, so that people can do their own research. Most definitely, I'm flattered and honored to do that.
Thank you so much. And we, so we'll include that with the one-pager document that we have that again has readings and other resources relevant to this training. So with that, thank you again so much, Dr. Reed. As a history museum, we strive to drive the point home of understanding the importance of the past in order to be fully competent and aware of present times and then the future. So we can't thank you enough. So with that, we'll actually take a 5-minute or so break. Well, actually it's 6:51. So we'll begin at 7 p.m. promptly with our next session, Dresden Lackey. Thank you. So I am going to go ahead and introduce Dresden. So Dresden Lackey is a PhD candidate in sociology at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. Her primary research interests include gendered racism, microaggressions, health disparities, social problems, and urbanization, which she studies through an intersectional and critical race theoretical lens. She previously has done research at Emory University, the University of Baltimore, the National Institute of Health, and Johns Hopkins University. Dresden teaches undergraduate courses on race and ethnicity, social problems in America, and gender inequality. She currently serves as her department's teaching associate, providing mentorship to upcoming graduate instructors. She has won several honors and awards for her accessible teaching methods and has been an invited speaker on issues including systemic racism, intimate partner violence, and histories of legal racism in the US. I welcome Dresden Lackey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here today to talk about critical race theory. If you are interested in anti-racism work, critical race theory is an excellent foundation to start with. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity with the Banneker-Douglass Museum. And I've really been looking forward to putting this webinar on. And thank you so much to Sabria for facilitating and inviting me into this space. And also thank you to Dr. Reed. Your inclusion of law and your presentation will go so nicely with my presentation as well. And I really enjoyed hearing you speak too. So I'd like to start with kind of a thought exercise to introduce what critical race theory really is. I want everyone to imagine that you and a coworker are walking down the street and you pass by a person who is asking for money, who appears to be homeless. And your coworker leans to you and says, "Those bums are always asking for handouts instead of getting a real job." And you, as an educated scholar, you kind of give your coworker a little pushback about this comment, right? Because it was spoken pretty loudly, and you know that this homeless person probably heard this comment. And so you tell your coworker, you know, we should all strive to correct our classism, to correct our racism, our sexist thinking, and that these comments have consequences. So your coworker kind of makes this mental note, you know, to say, I'm not going to say those kinds of things around this person anymore, you know, mumbles something about political correctness, and then never says something like that again, but still holds these internalized beliefs. Is the homeless person really better off? Probably not, right? So your coworker's comments might go unspoken around him, but if something is inherent in the nature of our system, that system will continue to create and harm victims of the system, regardless of how nice we are to oppressed people. And so that includes poor people, Black or brown people, queer people, trans people, disabled people. And that's what critical race theory, that's really where critical race theory comes in. Critical race theorists want to examine the root of those issues, not just the actions and the attitudes between individuals, but really the systemic causes. So you might have heard this term critical race theory kind of floating around in the past couple months. Last fall, it became a bit of a buzzword because Donald Trump issued an executive order banning critical race theory and other racial sensitivity training from within federal agencies. And then the term kind of blew up all over, right? But while this was happening, it became really clear that Trump and a lot of the general public didn't really know what CRT was and how it operates. So as a critical race theorist and a sociologist, it was really interesting to hear some of the tenets that were ascribed to this theory. People were really critiquing critical race theory without really knowing what it was. But what critical race theory is a theoretical movement wherein scholars and activists study the relationship between race and power. And ultimately, critical race theory and critical race theorists understand that racism is rooted in white supremacy and that it maintains its power through law and focuses on transforming the relationship between racism and law. So there is a social justice component. Critical race theory was born out of critical legal studies. So critical race theorists are really examining the relationship between race and power through a law and a legal studies perspective. So the law is really essential in critical race theory. We take a systemic approach. So critical race theorists situate civil rights issues within kind of a broader perspective that accounts for history, economics, the location of a setting of an event, who has interests that can be furthered and advanced in these events, and how emotionality and the unconscious can really influence any given event. And it is really important. I want to come back to this structural foundation of critical race theory. I want to make sure that that's very clear. Critical race theorists are not looking at racialized events as individualized or even as events that occur, at certain points in time. Critical race theorists look at the racialized events as products of a larger structural institutional system that is white supremacy, and that speaks to race and racism's relationship with power. And in the US, power as a system is heavily, heavily reliant on the law. So we have to give credit where it's due. Critical race theory as a movement was formed when scholars and lawyers and activists realized that the advances of the civil rights era had kind of subsided by the 1970s. And we saw a lot of excitement and a lot of oomph about civil rights throughout the 1960s. But once the 70s came along, civil rights was kind of old news. People didn't have the same enthusiasm about it, the same energy about it that we saw in the 60s. And critical race theory really builds on the insights of two previous movements. So we had critical legal studies, but we also had radical feminism, and theorists that critical race pulled from included Antonio Gramsci. We had Michel Foucault, Sojourner Truth's work, Frederick Douglass' work, W.E.B. Du Bois, MLK, of course, and then also from Chicanx and Black Power movements. So it's a very interdisciplinary theory, and that's actually where it pulls a lot of its strengths. It doesn't live in just sociology or just legal studies. It pulls from all over. And then we have scholars like Derek Bell here, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, and they were among the first kind of critical race, the founders of critical race theory, whose key writings really formed the movement, along with a lot of others. And then, again, it's important to note that critical race theory really has this activist component. Critical race theorists try to understand our social situations as they exist, but they also are studying those things so that we can change it. That activist component, that work towards change is such an essential part of critical race scholarship. So there are a few basic foundational understandings of critical race theory that we need to understand in order to kind of get a grounding of what critical race theory brought to the table. So we're going to go over just those foundations from which critical race theorists are operating. Critical race theorists are really coming from the understanding of these four basic tenets, which guide the theory and its operation and its application as well. So the first is that racism is ordinary, it's not aberrational. And what that means is that racism is not something that happens once in a while. It's not just a comment or a hate crime, right? Racism is everywhere. And it's in our housing policies, it's in our police practicing, it's in our education systems, it's in our medicine, it's in our hard sciences. Racism is in our banks and our loan processes, it's in our interactions even with our own family members. It is everywhere, and racism is thus difficult to address because if it's something that's so widely normalized, it's so ordinary, it's not very easily acknowledged, in the same way that I can go all day without thinking about the air that I'm breathing. I just know that it's always there, and trust that it will always be there. So I don't have to acknowledge it for it to be so, right? So in that way, critical race theory really sees racism as something that has been permanent in US society. And we saw throughout Dr. Reed's presentation that we saw systemic racism as it has existed since even before the US was established and up until today. We can't, a big part of racism as being ordinary is that we can't simply remove all the racists in the world and then have this kumbaya society, right? Instead, racism is really embedded in our institutions, and though it changes over time, from slavery to segregation to Jim Crow to microaggressions to mass incarceration, it's really been prevalent for hundreds of years. It has permanence in our society. Next, critical race theorists understand this phenomenon called interest convergence. And we'll dig a little deeper into that momentarily, but interest convergence is this understanding that society has only allowed anti-racist laws or movements to succeed when those movements have simultaneously benefited white elites, as well as Black and brown people. So really we're seeing this, like Black and brown people are allowed to advance only if white people are also allowed to advance. There are countless examples of this. Derek Bell, again, one of the founders of critical race theory, suggests that this landmark Supreme Court case, one of his most prominent examples of interest convergence is in Brown versus Board of Education, which may have resulted more from the self-interest of elite whites than from a desire to help Black and brown students who were experiencing segregation in schools. And that's why Brown versus Board was able to be passed. White people stood to gain from Brown versus Board passing more so than Black and brown people stood for it to be passing. And we'll discuss that momentarily. We also understand, as critical race theorists, we understand what sociologists call social constructionism. So this thesis posits that race is actually not biological. It is a product of social thought and relations, not biology. Race is not fixed, it's not inherent, it's not objective. And we've seen how race can change over time. Who was considered white, who was afforded the privileges of whiteness over time. It doesn't correspond to a biological or a genetic reality. But it is a social reality. So biologists and social scientists both understand that race is socially constructed. Let me think. This race is assigned meaning by people. People don't have a race in as much as people are raced by society and categorized by society. So of course, the argument is that skin color, eye shape, hair texture, etc. Those things might vary across people, but these varieties also exist within races. You might have a lighter skinned Black person whose skin might be even lighter than a darker skinned white person, right? And so genetic scientists have really found that there's more differences within a racial group than between racial groups. And critical race theorists really understand that race is not a biological reality, but it is a social one. And the consequences of race, therefore, are real. So racism, the consequence of race, is very real, even if race itself is not among a biological reality. And finally, critical race theorists subscribe to intersectionality or intersectional theory. And this is also kind of a buzzword that's been floating around. But intersectional theory suggests that all of a person's identities contribute to their positions of privilege or oppression within a social hierarchy. So these identities cannot be disentangled. So for example, I can't separate the fact that I'm an Asian American person with the fact that I'm a woman. If someone asked me, do you identify more as Asian or more as a woman, like I can't separate those things out. These identities are inseparable to me. And in the same way, Black women can't separate their gender from their race, and white women can't separate their gender from their race. Their Blackness is entangled with their womanness. Their whiteness is as well entangled to their womanness in white womanhood. So all of our identities really work together in tandem to shape our experiences of privilege and oppression. This is incredibly relevant when we, look at activist movements over history. So we often hear about the women's rights movement, right? Or when women got the right to vote in the suffragette movement. But this doesn't really take into account the fact that the suffragette movement was largely based on racism, right? White women really wanted the right to vote and used Blackness as a way to kind of, or used Black people not obtaining the right to vote as a way to justify the fact that they should have the right to vote. It doesn't, take into account the fact that Native women, Asian women, and Black women didn't really get the right to vote during the women's suffragette movement. Only white women did. And so we hear about civil rights movements, the significance of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and that doesn't take into account the misogynoir, the misogyny that Black women specifically were facing, or the homophobia that queer and trans folks of color were facing during this time as well, right? And to continue to experience even within Black and brown spaces. So our identities, our sexuality, our ability, our nationality, and our race and gender, and more, all of these are inseparable from one another. And we experience different realities kind of based on that intersection of our identities. So you might have a Black woman who's marginalized because of her status as a racial minority and as a gender minority, but she might be privileged in her status as a straight person, or if she is wealthy and is high socioeconomic status, or as a cisgender person. Or you might have a white queer man who's privileged in his status as a white and male person, but marginalized in society by his status as queer or trans, or disabled or poor, right? And so intersectionality really places great importance on the intersection of your identities and the fact that you cannot separate out your race from your gender, from your sexuality, from your class. These are all enmeshed. So once we have an understanding of these four foundational beliefs, we can learn how critical race theory operates. So we can move into these tenets of critical race theory. So this is what critical race theory is really bringing to the table. And these tenets are interest convergence, which we've talked briefly about, and we'll dig a little deeper, a revisionist history, critique of liberalism, and structural determinism. And critical race theory has really grown over the past 40 years or so. There's been many, many tenets of critical race theory that have grown out of these four, but we'll go over these that are generally accepted by critical race theory, and then we'll dive a little deeper into a couple others at the end. So interest convergence. So this term was coined by one of the founders, again, Derek Bell. And this theory suggests that courts will uphold Black interests when they align, and only when they align, with the interests of white elites and not otherwise. So what that means is throughout history, we have only allowed the advancement of Black and brown people when white people were also had something to gain. And once that movement has been benefited white elites to the most that it can, momentum subsides from that movement, and subsequently it stops benefiting Black and brown people as well. So I'll give a few examples from history. So the most obvious one is emancipation, the freeing of enslaved Black people. On the surface, emancipation benefited Black enslaved people more so than white slave owners, right? But this historic act really served the interests of white policymakers. So of course, Abraham Lincoln opposed slavery, we know that. But at the core, he really believed the Civil War was waged to maintain the American Union. And it was not, to Lincoln, the Civil War was not about the morality of slavery. However, by the late 1862, the North was not close to winning the war, and the Civil War had been going on for almost 2 years. Lincoln then, had to think about in what way can the American Union advance? And his advisors suggested that emancipating enslaved people would serve the Northern interests by interrupting the Southern rural economy, which relied almost entirely on slave labor. So further, the North could also increase its army by encouraging newly freed Black people to enlist in the American Union. So this is interest convergence. This is the merging of two sides, right? The Black enslaved people were able to gain freedom, and the white elites of the American Union were able to gain more people on their side, and also to simultaneously kind of disrupt the Southern economy. So according to Derek Bell's theory, this is why emancipation of slavery happened when it did. It actually served white elites as well. Again, one of the ones that Derek Bell most frequently points to is Brown versus Board of Education. And we all know this story, right? This is the Plessy versus Ferguson is kind of dismantled with Brown versus Board. Segregation is deemed unconstitutional. So this Supreme Court case determined that segregation in schools specifically was not constitutional. And by legally desegregating Black and Brown students would be able to benefit from the resources that were allocated within white schools. So of course, it's considered quite a win for Black students who had previously been attending very poor, under-resourced schools, right? But what's less spoken about when we learn about Brown versus Board in schools is that Brown versus Board was happening during the midst of the Cold War. And US adversaries abroad were really eyeing the US and had a lot of skepticism. You know, why is the US still segregated? Why do they treat Black people so poorly? You know, it's been almost 100 years since the Civil War. So it was a really bad look. The US looked really, really bad to the rest of the world. And all eyes were kind of on the US for the first time in a while because of our involvement with the Cold War at this time. So by desegregating schools, the interests of both Black and Brown people, as well as white elites who wanted the US to look good so that we could gain allyship, those interests converged and they came together. They both sides benefited, right? And since this was first posited by Derek Bell in the 80s, archivists have actually done extensive research of US ambassadors corresponding at this time and found that Bell was correct in this theory. The US civil rights legislation wasn't passed to improve the lives of people of color. Like, that wasn't the reason that Brown versus Board was passed. It was passed to make the US look better to third world countries that we wanted for potential allyship. And interestingly, once the courts declared this ideological victory, it really took about 10 years for schools to actually desegregate after Brown versus Board was passed. 10 years. Right. And so the language in the ruling was very vague, intentionally vague. It instructed states to desegregate schools in a timely fashion. And that was the language that was used. You know, just do it in a timely fashion, whatever that means. And that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different states. Right. So a lot of states really took their time on desegregation, even after Brown versus Board was passed. And now we're, 60 years some out from Brown versus Board. Schools are still about just as segregated as they were when the courts first announced this decision, informally, but they really are just as segregated. So, the question is ultimately, was the interest of Black and Brown's equal education actually at the heart of this ruling? If they didn't care to enforce it quickly, they're not even making sure that this is happening in an actual timely manner. So who is truly benefiting from Brown versus Board? So we saw interest convergence again in the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s when the economy was failing because of the Cold War, and informal segregation in housing and schools and workplaces were really dragging the economy down, especially in Southern states. So when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it was kind of this instrumental ruling that was used to revive the economy, especially in Lyndon B. Johnson's beloved Southern states. So not only did the Civil Rights Act boost the economy, but it also allowed the military to, again, recruit from a larger pool of people of color that are campaigning for things related to the space race. So again, we have to situate this within what was going on with the rest of the world and what the US wanted to advance within that time frame. Another example of interest convergence that's brought up a lot is affirmative action. So we're kind of seeing this in conversation today too, right? Critical race theorists are really skeptical of affirmative action as kind of this band-aid policy that doesn't truly eradicate inequalities. And research has actually shown that white women are the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action policies. Their status as women affords them this within the definition of a marginalized group, which yes is true, but affirmative action is otherwise kind of, painted and depicted as this people of color policy when people of color are not the ones that are benefiting the most from affirmative action policies. So there's countless other examples, but for the sake of time, I'll let you read about those on your own. But I'd really like you to consider, with what elites have to gain, what elite whites have to gain in this country by, for example, the election of Barack Obama in 2008, or by the current Black Lives Matter movement. These are both examples of interest convergence where both white and Black parties do benefit. The interests have converged. And critical race theorists would argue that white elites are actually benefiting more than Black people by the election of Obama, as well as in some ways by the BLM movement as well. So ultimately, critical race theorists believe that Black and brown rights are not advanced unless white interests also stand to benefit. And this leads nicely to our next tenet. Critical race theorists believe in revisionist history. And revisionist history re-examines America's historical record, and it replaces these kind of comforting majoritarian interpretation of events with ones that square more accurately with minorities' experiences. And what that means is critical race theory tries to re-examine our history as we know it through the lens of people of color who have been historically marginalized. So I can probably safely assume that if you had a grade school education here in the US, your textbooks covered Christopher Columbus, George Washington, JFK, we'll throw Susan B. Anthony in there for diversity, right? And let's just throw MLK in there probably, I don't know, in February for Black History Month, right? And that's it, just in February. Critical race theorists really challenge the way that our history has been written. And our history has been written in a way that typically centers white elites and other people in dominant and privileged positions. Critical race theorists really emphasize what we call counter stories or standpoint epistemologies. And these counter stories highlight and center the experiences of marginalized people. So when we focus on these counter stories and the experiences of people who have been oppressed, we get a better picture of what our history has truly held versus what's being pushed in textbooks. So for example, as a race scholar, I've heard a lot of narratives about nice slave owners. Anytime I want to talk about the abuse of enslaved people in the US, someone pipes in and says, well, some slave owners really treated their slaves like members of their family. No one ever chimes in to, talk about the rampant sexual assault and abuse of Black women, the historic physical violence that was inflicted upon enslaved peoples. And Commissioner Thompson, I noticed in the chat earlier during Dr. Reed's lecture, you pointed out Martha Washington's complicity in slave ownership. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because that's also something white women who were married to white men who owned slaves are really discounted from the conversation a lot. No one ever talks about white women as slave owners. And there's a really excellent book by Stephanie Jones Rogers called They Were Her Property that talks specifically about the white women who owned slaves during this time. And so just wanted to plug that book. But critical race theory really works to correct this narrative. So where racism in history is kind of depicted as not that bad, or other, type, not just racism in throughout history, but racism today is considered better than it was, right? So critical race theorists place a lot of emphasis on the importance of storytelling, counter storytelling, to really bring the narrative back to oppressed populations. And they believe that stories have great value in exposing the racialized components of US history that don't really get recorded in history books. Critical race theorists are also really critical of liberalism, and this one's really touchy. But specifically, we are critical of the liberalist belief in colorblindness. And I'm sure you've all heard it, or perhaps you've even said it yourself. I don't see color. I treat everyone the same. I don't see you as Black. I just see you as a person. So liberalism, tends to focus on merit and equality rather than on race, right? And suggests that we should be colorblind instead of acknowledging race, because equal treatment of all people is better, regardless of their different histories or cultural situations. And critical race theorists are really pushing back on this. So some people even claim, with the election of Obama, we're in a post-racial society. I've heard this too, although I'm not sure how easily convincible that is if you've paid attention to the last 4 years or so. Critical race theorists really critique this belief, right? So colorblindness is really pervasive because it really gets in the way of taking account of differences in order to eradicate the needs that people have to do a color correctness, really. So race might be seen as race might be a social construct, not rooted in biology again, but the consequences of race are real. So if we pretend we don't see color, then we can't account for the very reality that consequences that people of color are facing simply because of their race. Critical race theorists really understand this and really push for this recognition of race, right? We can't pretend we don't see race. Race matters because in our society, in our history, our experiences and our collective memory and our laws have really depended on race. So critical race theorists are also very suspicious of another liberal mainstay, rights. In our system, rights are almost always procedural, meaning they're, such as a right to a fair process, rather than substantive. So for example, food, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to healthcare. Our system really applauds, affording everyone equality of opportunity, but it tends to resist programs that assure equality of results. So if we look at legal history, we can really see that rights are almost always cut back when they conflict with the interests of the powerful. So again, we're bringing back interest convergence. So for example, hate speech is a good example that critical race theorists have discussed. So hate speech tends to target marginalized people, but it receives very little legal protection. So this idea that the First Amendment allows people to say kind of whatever garbage they want without consequence, right? But speech that offends the interests of people in power, there's an exception in the First Amendment to that, right? So example, think about speech that insults a judge or another authority figure. Speech that defames a wealthy or well-regarded person. We have these defamation lawsuits, or speech that divulges a government secret. The interests of those powerful figures are protected under the First Amendment, but speech against marginalized groups is argued over. It's seen as a First Amendment issue. We're not really sure whether that counts or not, right? So that's another critique of liberalism that critical race theorists hold. And meritocracy is another component of liberalism that CRT tends to reject. And this is the idea that if you just work hard enough, you can succeed. Meritocracy really discounts the centuries of legal racism that have been impacted by opportunities of people of color and dismantles this bootstraps myth. So power, generational wealth, familial resources, all of those are influencing people's ability to succeed today, regardless of how hard they're working. So if your family came over on the Mayflower and made money off of the work of unpaid enslaved people, and then when in emancipation happened, your family was given free property and a mule, as white slave owners were, then, and then you always had the right to vote on top of that, to vote in your own self-interest, right? Those things can be passed down from generation to generation in some capacity, and that contributes to your success today. So people of color weren't afforded those privileges, and so generational wealth and privilege looks much different for people of color that didn't have those advantages. And then finally, the notion of neutrality is a component of liberalism that critical race theorists critique. And we hear about the law as neutral, we hear about science as neutral, as being colorblind, but as we've seen, law and science and standardized education and other seemingly neutral proponents of our society are not truly neutral. They have been influenced by those in power, and those in power tend to be elite whites, and those are the ones who are shaping these areas that are benefiting other elite whites, right? So in the US, whiteness is unmarked, meaning unless someone points out that someone was not white, they're assumed to be white. We saw a lot of pushback recently with Ariel, the new Little Mermaid, being Black, or we had the Annie musical in the 90s was a Black actress, or Brandy and Cinderella in the 90s was a Black actress, and people really hated that. They did not, and these are fictional characters, right? But they really did not want Black actresses to be cast in these fictional characters. There was so much upset over it because even if they were not specifically written as white characters, the neutrality of their characters affords them whiteness. So whiteness is unmarked, and it's not racialized in the ways that Blackness and Asianness and First Nations and Indigenous Latinx populations are. So thus, when whiteness is seen as the default and thus it's unmarked, this liberalist idea of neutrality and objectivity is really actually racialized. It is racialized as white. And finally, critical race theorists believe that our system is incapable of redressing certain types of wrongs. So we all know the story that, or we've all heard that some Inuit languages have over 50 different words for different types of snow, right? Light snow has a different word from slushy snow or frosty snow or thick snow. All of these have different unique words because they're all somewhat different, even though they exist under this general term of snow. So critical race theorists see the opposite is true for racism, meaning racism is much more complex than a simple word can really portray. We have subtle racism, we have physically violent racism, we have nativism, xenophobia, institutional racism, systemic racism, unconscious racism, microaggressions, biological racism, but all of these exist kind of under this overarching home of racism, even if they're all very distinct. So while scholars of race and ethnicity have, certainly coined terms to address these different types of racism, these terms are not really living outside of the academy. We're not really seeing these terms infiltrate the general public, and definitely not infiltrating law and policy, which is where they'll really matter, right? So structural determinism then is suggesting that because we have limitations in our vocabulary, people, and especially folks who don't experience racism, generally have limitations in understanding racism and other inequalities in ways that people of color do not. So we can't properly address them if we don't have this language, and if we don't have this language in our law and policy. So just based on, the terminology that we've talked about today, interest convergence, intersectionality, social constructionism, I would even throw in microaggressions, these are not commonly found in standard legal reference work. So how can they be considered when we're looking at the law to redress racism? Critical race theorists really want to eradicate this in law and policy, and in that way, really advance this social justice narrative. So what that means is critical race theorists believe that the structure of our society influences what can and will be addressed in terms of inequity. So we need to be introducing these things into law and policy. Check the time. Okay, so there's a number of other tenets of critical race theory that aren't limited to those main foundational beliefs, but that are shaped by critical perspectives. And one of these is white privilege. And there's been a lot of conversation about white privilege in the past year or so, but this is not a new idea, right? White privilege is this understanding that white people, regardless of their class, regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender, their ability, their nationality, benefit from their whiteness in ways that people of color don't. That's not to say that white people don't face oppressions in other identities, that can be marginalized. They might face oppression in nationalization, or they might face oppression through their sexual orientation or their ability or something else. It just means that their whiteness affords them a specific type of privilege that benefits them. The privilege of whiteness is not just the fact that they get stopped, less for traffic stops, or that when they commit mass shootings, they're taken in unharmed or something like that. right? Critical race theorists see white privilege as really shaping our education systems, shaping our housing policies, shaping our medicine and our laws that serve the best interests of whites. So you can be stopped by police every day as a white person. Every day of the year, a cop could stop you, but you would still benefit from white privileges systemically in other ways. So another component of CRT is internalization. And this is when people of color internalize anti-Black and anti-Brown messages. Critical race theorists argue that, that this is a byproduct of white supremacy, where Black and Brown people are receiving constant, incessant messages that they are lesser than. They're receiving these messages, not just, direct hate speech, but through institutions as well. And that message gets internalized. And we see this in colorism, where darker skin is criminalized, lighter skin is praised. We see this in the bootstrap myths, again, going back to meritocracy, where, if we have people of color that might be financially successful, they believe that other people of color should be able to overcome the systemic barriers to achieve economic success. We also see this in beauty standards. When natural hair is pathologized, you have to chemically straighten your hair in order to be regarded as professional or beautiful, things like that, right? That's all an internalization of white supremacy. And we also see anti-essentialism in critical race theory. Essentialism is this belief that all people, oppressed people within a group, suffer from the same oppression. And critical race theorists really reject this idea. We kind of believe that, going back to intersectionality, our identities shape our experiences with racism. So, for example, wealthy Black men are not facing the same types of racism as poor Black women. Straight cisgender Black women are not facing the same types of racism as trans Black women. So that's not to say they're not all experiencing racism, they are, but racism can't be this one size fits all term, right? We reject this idea that it's all the same. There are variations in type. Critical race theory has grown so much over the past 30 or 40 years. We've seen a lot of scholars that have used critical race perspectives in other fields, and we've now got strong scholarship in Latin Chicanx crit. We see disability critical race theory, we see Asian crit, queer crit, critical whiteness studies, and all of these have been kind of shaped and influenced by critical race theory. So bringing it back to the purpose of this training, critical race theorists really examine the roots of bigotry against Black people and other people of color in the US, and that's simply what critical race theory is. So by examining this history, we can see how the law, how the economy, foreign affairs, civil rights, et cetera, have shaped the oppression that Black and Brown people face in today's world. We saw how racism in the US is rooted in the first settler colonialist landing on indigenous soil and has really flourished with the transatlantic slave trade that ensured about 400,000 enslaved Africans were sold in North America alone. Maryland was actually one of the top slave selling states just after Virginia and South Carolina. And then when Abraham Lincoln, of course, realized that emancipation would serve the Northern interests by disrupting the Southern economy, we also saw how people of color are appeased by small victories like Obama's election or the Civil Rights Act. We get these small breadcrumbs, but then these victories either lose momentum or they don't truly advance people of color situation in a systemically racist society. So we see racism and white supremacy flourish today, despite emancipation, despite desegregation, despite the election of Obama. We still are seeing so much rampant systemic racism today. So we can talk about these roots of bigotry, and it's really important to connect these roots to today. I can't tell you how many people that I've heard say, well, racism isn't solved, but it's better than it used to be. But critical race theory really rejects this idea that racism today is better than it ever was. Instead, we argue that it just looks different. It's evolved from slavery to indentured servitude to segregation to the war on drugs to mass incarceration. Going back to Dr. Reed's suggestion for Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. There's also a documentary on Netflix called 13th that addresses this. And Malcolm X once said, one of my favorite quotes in talking about racism, he said, racism is like a Cadillac. They come out with a new model every year. Critical race theorists really see how racism has advanced and evolved, and even in these secret kind of sneaky ways, it's come out with these new models, these new Cadillacs, kind of adapting to the ways, to the needs of white supremacy. And we need to examine this true nature of these small victories like Brown versus Board or the election of Obama through a critical lens, because otherwise these breadcrumbs of success that we're happy to get, if we just settle for those, then we as oppressed people are happy with the breadcrumbs, and then we're never going to ask to be part of the feast, to have a larger part of the pie. So this was such a brief overview of what critical race theory was. I wish I could teach a whole class for a semester on this, but shoving it into 45 minutes, I hope was beneficial. But there's a lot of resources that have been put together for you to read more about critical race theory. These are a few of my favorites, and thank you to Dr. Amanda Johnson for putting together a fuller resource list that I think will be available to everyone. So White by Law, these are all books. White by Law by Ian Haney-Lopez talks about how whiteness has been transformed throughout US history, and how some people have been categorized as white, and how that has changed throughout US history. Critical Race Feminism is a collection of works that was edited by Adrienne Catherine Wing, and specifically brings CRT back into the feminist, radical feminist movement. Faces at the Bottom of the Well is an excellent book of short stories that Derek Bell has written. It's super accessible. If you don't like a lot of academic jargon, I highly recommend this one. Alchemy of Race and Rights by Patricia J. Williams talks a lot about the legality of being a Black woman in law. And what my personal favorite is Ain't I a Woman? Black Women in Feminism by Bell Hooks, also excellent for accessibility. And thank you so much for joining me. Please feel free to connect with me further if you'd like to discuss. Here's all of my contact info. And thank you again to Sabria and the Banneker-Douglass Museum, and for Dr. Reed for inviting me today.
Wow. That was excellent, Dresden. When you were ending, I'm sitting here like just as an attendee. I forgot that I was actually facilitating the program, and I'm taking in everything that you're saying. I did, we weren't going to take questions, but Dresden, one question came across while you were lecturing, and I wanted to see if you would address it, and particularly because it involved Thurgood Marshall, a native son of the state of Maryland, and it asked, does, I guess not in your opinion, but you can maybe answer this factually, does critical race theory undermine his work? And I had my own ideas on that, but as a critical race theorist, could you briefly address that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I would say no. I think critical race theory really builds on the work of other Black scholars, and looks at Thurgood Marshall included, looks at the ways that the law has been, and I would actually include William Julius Wilson in this as well, looks at the ways in which law has been not just advancing white elites in these, how should I phrase this? I'm sorry.
You're fine. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Not at all. No, I think critical race theorists are really looking at the ways in which when Black and Brown civil rights are being advanced, white elites do stand to gain from it. And when we look at the work of William Julius Wilson, Thurgood Marshall, and other Black scholars who have specifically worked a lot with law, it's really building from that work rather than disagreeing with it, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Dresden, again, I learned so much, particularly that fact about the more differences that exist within a racial group than outside. That was mind-blowing. So thank you so much. I'm actually going to launch the poll now. So if you are here and willing to and can answer, these really help us just with further programs and, you know, making sure that we're getting feedback from the community and our participants, and, you know, that allows us to strengthen future programs. So again, I wanted to, you know, thank Dr. Reed, thank Dresden. You know, this it was great. Like, I'm sitting here in awe and just thinking about, you know, what's to come next. As I mentioned, if you are on our mailing list, you will be receiving some resources from this lecture, and then you'll be receiving information about upcoming trainings. I wanted to thank, of course, the Anti-Racism Coalition, who I've been working closely with to produce these programs and bring them to you. I wanted to thank the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, all of our sponsors, and thank you all for taking this time out to attend this program. And then I wanted to say that although I wish that race relations in this country were at a better place than they currently are, I can only hope for a better tomorrow. So if you haven't done so already, please complete the poll. Make sure that you're kind to others, and please, in the midst of that, be kind to yourselves as well. And we will see you all at our next program. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for the comments as well in the chat. We're getting really great feedback. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Wow, 100% of our participants voted. That's great. That's excellent. Good night, everyone.